this evening I wanted to talk about Buddha nature. It's an idea, it's a concept, but it's an actuality, or it's pointing to something. It's pointing to something within ourselves. And it's really a useful idea. It's a useful concept to think about and to contemplate. And the idea basically is that our essential nature, our essential experience is Buddha nature, which is, of course, it's not Buddha. It's the essential nature of consciousness, or the essential nature of awareness. And that's interwoven into all our experiences. We're not separate from it. So there's a fundamental underlying truth. If you were Christian, you might call it Christ consciousness. If you were Hindu, you might call it the Atman or Brahman. But it's that essential underlying fabric that weaves through the entirety of the universe and the entirety of our little old experiences as well. So there's an aspect to ourselves that is fundamentally pure. And of course, in these teachings, these ideas that are presented, they're ideas for you to contemplate, they're ideas for you to think about, and to see the truth in those ideas for yourself. It's not a belief system where you need to believe something, but is there something within you, within all of us, that is fundamentally pure, that is fundamentally not separate from anything else? It always comes back to investigating the mind, investigating the conscious experience. So that's why we, sometimes in the classes, or I talk more about the process of developing calm, as we did with like Anapanasati retreat. And if you know the sutta, in the first 4-8, in the first 10 tetrads, that's what we're doing, or steps. We are developing calm. But the reason to develop calm is that so we can investigate our mind, that we can investigate our experience from a point of relative quietness and stillness. And when I use the word quietness and stillness, I mean a quality of mind that's clear, that is able to look at this piece of paper and just be with the looking, just be with the seeing, and not have a bunch of other stuff in the way, but to really just be with that experience. So we start with the breath, and we refine that quality of looking, that quality of watching, that quality of clarity by developing calm, by developing focus or concentration, by developing stillness or quietness that comes from that practice. And by developing the ability to watch without reacting. So that's the development of calm. We develop a keen sense of mindfulness always. So we begin to watch and we begin to see what the mind is doing. If we want to see the mirror clearly, we have to clean the dust off it. So the calming meditations are just a way of clearing the mind so we can turn our attention towards that underlying aspect of mind or consciousness that's not content. And that's where the work begins. We develop through the development of calm and watching, we develop the capacity of mind to not get caught up in the narratives, the constant, narratives of mind. We begin through the constant watching. Through the development of calm, we develop the ability to watch so we don't get pulled in by the narratives. And we start to see how the mind is constantly unsatisfied with what is. It's constantly unsatisfied with what is. We're always waiting for the next thing. We're waiting for spring. But spring comes and it's too short. And we're waiting for summer. And then summer's too hot. And then summer's gone. And then we're thinking of November. And then it's winter. And it's this constant cycle in our life. The seasons are just an example. But we're rarely content or satisfied. If we do have a contentment, a feeling of contentment or satisfaction, how long does it last? How long does it last? And even if you've gotten to a place in your life where you are relatively content and you don't have the struggles that you had before, and maybe the struggles of work, or the struggles of money, or the struggles of a certain relationship, or you've just figured things out enough, and there's a relative feeling of contentment. That's good. That's good. But if you look closer, there is still a kind of angst that's there. There is still an underlying sense of something that's unsatisfactory for most of us. Because the mind is looking outside of itself, for some kind of resolve, for some kind of resolution. Oh, when this happens, everything will be different. When this happens, everything will be different. I'll be better then. So when we talk about Buddha nature, when we talk about taking refuge in the Buddha, it's a teaching that there is an aspect of ourselves that's connected with something that's fundamentally pure, that actually can't be lost. So we can think about that. And maybe you've had an experience of that. Maybe you've had a sense of that. That's what the spiritual pursuits are really about, is finding that, looking for that aspect of life that is really not part of the temporal, not part of the temporary. So the way into that is through investigating the mind, investigating our conscious experience. Because what else do we have? You know, you can grab onto some ideas, you can grab onto a religion or a church, and that might work. But on this path, the idea is that you develop the ability, the qualities to make a true connection with that which is not part of the temporal, as part of something else. I remember a long time ago when I was a young fellow in pursuit of all this in India, and I was sharing a house with some other Westerners, and there was a French woman who was there, and she was in India seeking, and I was pretty into what I was into, which was, you know, an expression of this, I guess, although they were the early days. And I remember she was, she said to me one day, but what if it's not true? Right? Like she was seeking, she was traveling around India. She was actually a doctor. She was, but she was very young, so I don't really know if she had practiced or what. But anyway, she was like, so what if it's not true? And I didn't have anything to say to that because I didn't know really. But I was certain in my pursuit of moving forward. I wasn't sure what I was moving forward to, you know, but I was certain in that. And it seemed, at first, it seemed like a ridiculous question to me, because of course it's true, but I didn't really know that to be true. I was like, And then I had to think about it. And I had to question myself, you know, like, what if all this stuff is just, you know, is all just kind of made up, and really life is really just a shoebox with shoes that never fit, you know? But something in me had a feeling of being certain about it. And I don't know where I get that from, but I think that's part of the fundamental. If we can use the word Buddha nature, but it doesn't have to be that word. That's just pointing to something. But if we can use that word. So I think that fundamental nature is there and wants to be heard. And I think while we have a lot of confusion and uncertainty and fear, then it's hard to listen to that voice. I think it's hard to listen to that voice. So the beauty of this practice is we develop calm and we develop mindfulness to lessen the suffering in the mind, the confusion in the mind, so we can look and see what's there for ourselves. And maybe there's something there, and maybe there's not. But it opens us up to that experience. Have you ever just, I'm sure you have, you looked out on a starry night and looked at the vast expanse of the sky. And just that sense of wonder. That's Buddha nature. Being expressed. Sense of wonder, a sense of looking at something that's so vast and so big and so undefinable that maybe for a moment it takes our breath away. And that is in this moment right here. But we get so caught up in the confusion, we get so caught up in the seasons and the change of seasons and want it to be something other than it is. So we watch. And then what happens is at some point in the watching, in the mindfulness, in the watching, things slow down enough. Things get quiet enough so that we can turn our attention to the experience of the watcher, to the experience of watching. And that's what we're moving towards. Is getting enough of the noise tuned down so we can rest in the experience of watching. And when we are resting in the experience of watching, nothing changes. In some ways, nothing changes. It's just a subtle shift in identifying what we identify with. So we're not identifying with the confusion. We're not identifying with the mental states or the thoughts. We're identifying with, or we're resting in that which knows. And when we get relatively quiet, or if we know how to look, then that's always there. So for people who aren't good at meditating, that have a hard time calming their mind, or have a hard time focusing, this is a actual practice you can just go to. It's tricky because the mind is so tricky, we get pulled away by thought very quickly. And that's why the samadhi, that's why the calm is so useful. But basically, we end up at that point where we're resting in the experience of watching. It's not something, we don't have to watch at that point, because it's taking place. You're conscious, right? It's already happening. But we need enough clarity to be able to do that subtle shift in our focus. So we're focusing on the experience of the watcher. And we start to have a sense of the nature of that watcher. We start to have a sense of it. And that watcher is not being moved by anything. It's, you could call it the changeless. And when we start to really begin to understand that, it really lightens our load. Because we don't have to carry around all of this stuff. We can just let it come and we can let it go. When we're resting in the watcher or identifying with that, we're still in life. We're still moving through our day. Everything is happening as it was before. But we're connecting with things in a different way. We're not getting pulled in the same way. So we learn to rest in that experience. And then we stop trying to change anything. We stop fighting with things. What's there to change? How could we possibly change anything? So this is where the true calm comes from, the true peace comes from. Call it what you will. All of the techniques we do are just to bring us to a point where we're really able to have a taste of this. All the other work is always very, very valid. We need to be very mindful. We need to be very present, very watchful, because the mind is so tricky. You know, you can have an experience of a really quiet, expansive mind in one moment, and the next moment, you're somewhere else completely. But if you're identifying with the watcher, you're not. But the storyline in the mind is going off one way or the other. But when you're identified with the watcher, then you're not so worried about that storyline. You're not worried about it. So when I talked a few classes ago about moving towards the wholesome, is another way to think about it is we we move towards those things that bring us to this place. We move towards those things in our life, in our lifestyle, that allow us to rest in this place. To connect with this part of ourselves. And then a lot of our conditioning just loses its power.